Hey everybody, welcome back to the ProgCast. I'm Gregg Bendian, your host. Always here to explore the minds of incredible creative musicians around the world. And for those of you who are patrons, we are now offering bonus Q&As, which we're calling the lightning rounds. So hit us on patreon.net and you will find out who we're going to have and what the questions are going to be, because they're going to be a lot of fun. So don't miss out on those. Speaking of around the world, we have an American composer who's living in Paris for quite a long time. He's a multi-instrumentalist, composer, conceptualist, and today he's my guest, Rhys Chatham. Hi, Rhys. How are you?
I'm well, Greg. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast.
I'm so happy to have you because, we cover all these different strains of how people conceptualize music, how they create their own musical universe. And you, sir, are certainly one of the people who has created a musical universe. I wondered, as I was preparing for today's talk, what your early experiences were, because I'm not even clear on what your first instrument was, since I know that you play guitar, trumpet, flutes, keyboards, all sorts of things. You're widely known for your guitar work and the guitar orchestration and incredible expansion of the idea of what is serious music. And I want to talk about all that stuff, but I did want to kind of get an idea of your roots.
Well, just quickly, um, my first instrument was virginals, which is a which is kind of like a small harpsichord. And the reason that became my first instrument was my father was a early music fan, playing pieces from the Fitzwilliam Virginals book. John Dolan, Giles Farnaby, John Bull, composers like that. And so I grew up around the house hearing mostly early music from the school of Notre Dame and uh, plain chant. And we would go up to Baroque, a little bit of Stravinsky, the history of the soldier,
Yeah.
but that was about it. And and then I was living out on Long Island then. My parents decided I was born in Manhattan, but they decided I should have trees. So we lived in a place called East Rockaway in Nassau County. And there was a great school there, an elementary school, and they started me, I don't know, at 7 years old or something like that on clarinet. So I played, that was my first wind instrument. But then my father got ants in his pants and he needed to dance because he wanted to go to the discotheque. And so he moved back to Manhattan, and his wife decided she would move back with him, even though she was a country girl. But so we moved to East 19th Street, and and for a couple of years, they didn't have a music school at PS 40, which was on 19th Street between First and Second. But then I went to junior high school 104, and they had a great music program, and I got in it, and it was like I majored in music, and I started on French horn. I have to tell you this story. Uh, Actually, I think it was 1963, I had watched the Ed Sullivan Show, and there was this group called the Beatles that played, and I got inspired by them.
I've
And
heard of
so
them.
yeah, they're an interesting group. And I I said, Mom, Dad, I want to be like Ringo. And
Oh.
lived in a 5 room walk up fifth story apartment in Manhattan. And my parents were very smart. They said, I mean, they're both classical musicians, right? And so they said, well, drums is a very, very nice instrument, very, very beautiful. But flute there's such a wide repertoire for flute, but much wider than drums. Why don't you, kid, play the flute? And I was so stupid, I listened to them. And so in junior high school 104, I played actually I started on French horn, but then I switched to flute because there was this girl I liked in the flute section. And so I was the only boy in the flute section, so I was in heaven. That was another reason for switching to flute. And initially I went to this place called the Third Street Music School, which is a lot of people have been through. And I lucked out and got this great teacher who's still on the New York scene. She was very young back then. She's older now, as I am. Uh, called Sue-Ann Khan, Kahn, wonderful flutist. And initially, we just played the standard classical repertoire. We played Bach, all the Bach sonatas. There were also violin sonatas, but you could play them on flute as well. But then I heard a piece by a composer named Edgar Varese. And I don't have to even tell you, Greg, the name of the piece. I mean, you're a composer also, but I heard Density 21.5 and it changed my life. And so I asked my teacher if she could teach it to me. And I really lucked out in the sense that she was a contemporary music specialist,
Who?
and Suan Khan. And
Oh, wait a minute. So do I know her from None Such Recordings?
She was the president of the Flute Society in New York, and she's quite well known.
Yes.
But she wasn't well known back then. And but I lucked out, and as it happened in 2 weeks, she was doing a concert at Carnegie Recital Hall, featuring works by the composer from Chicago, Ralph Shapey. Stefan Volpe wrote a piece for flute and piano. She may have played the David Dosky piece, Synchronisms.
Yeah.
But in any case, I started out with the Varese piece, and then I branched out to Hindemith Sonata for flute and piano. And then we have this wonderful pianist at Third Street Music School named Ed Neiman, and he's a pianist. He's played with Steve Reich, and he's still on the New York scene, I believe. And he was able to play. I wanted to play the Messiaen piece, "The Blackbird's Night," "Le Mer Noir," and the piano part, especially in the final section, is very asynchronous and it's quite difficult. And he nailed it. And my flute teacher played piano, and it was wonderful playing with her, Suan Khan, because she would play the Bach sonatas with me. It's always nicer during the lesson to play with another musician. But she said, I'm not playing this Messiaen piece. And so Ed agreed to do it with me. And then I'll finish with this, as far as the early things go. But then I ran into what do you call it? The flute sonate for flute and piano by Pierre Boulez.
Boulez, yeah.
And whoa, I really wanted to play that because he wrote that when he was very young. I think it was 22 when he wrote it. And so you can just feel the hormones in the rhythmic sections of the piece. And my flute teacher, again, she said, I know this piece. Yeah, and she played it with a pianist. I don't quite recall the pianist's name, but she said, I ain't playing the piano part. She didn't say it like that. She was a very cultured lady, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
But fortunately, my parents knew the keyboard player of the New York Philharmonic, Paul Jacobs. May he rest in peace. And he very generously agreed to, he knew the piece, and he generously agreed to sight read it, to play through it with me. So I got to play the Sonata for Flute and Piano by Pierre Boulez. So that was my introduction to contemporary music. And then I'm going to segue into something else now, if that's okay.
Well,
Because,
can I
yeah,
jump in because
yeah, by all
you
means.
so much there. There's so much there. You are, I had kind of this conversation with Ursula Oppens and Gil Kalish because I'm very interested in that moment where this music is coming out atonal or, let's just call it individualist approaches.
Or we
But
could
you
call
have
it
the,
post-serial,
okay, that's good too.
European post-serial, atonal, arrhythmic.
Truly. So I had this conversation with Ursula Oppens, which was when this stuff started happening and you were there. And for instance, Paul Jacobs, Carter was writing night fantasies for them. So, and I'm around as a high school student, taking all this stuff in. I was studying with one of the guys from Speculum, Jeff Kresge, piano player, was my composition professor when I was in high school. And it's so interesting to me because what's going on? You have to figure out each each composer's universe. And you just named Volpe, you just named Boulez, you just named Varese, who was my entree, not only just as a percussionist, but as a composer. I felt that I could understand to a certain degree that Varese was like trying to rock my world. And then I heard Amerique's live, and it was louder than a lot of rock concerts. I'm sure if you've experienced it, you know exactly what I'm saying. Amerique gets fucking dense and loud, right? So this is all very interesting. And to the point that I'd like to present to you, which is you had the foundation that very few musicians have, which is not only just a musical family, but you went through early music. So in the context of that foundation, how are you receiving the composers we just mentioned, Varese, Stravinsky, anything that's going to be outside the bounds?
Well, fortunately, uh, my father really, whose name was Price Chatham, really liked the contemporary music. He thought I introduced him to it. I mean, he heard me playing it and he said, "Oh, that's beautiful." And then I introduced him to Xenakis and yeah, Stockhausen wrote a piece called Stimmung that had a flute part. And I was pissed off because I didn't have a B foot on my flute, and it starts out with a B. So I had to get a B foot for my flute. Um, there really was a current back then where we were, yeah, young composers like you and me when we were in high school were reading Deria, Thoreau, yeah,
Perspectives.
like it was we were reading Being in Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, reading every word, all about I had to ask my teacher, what does permutation mean? And she says, I think it has to do with pregnancy. uh, uh,
But yeah, I
the na-
remember
remember that?
taking it all in. Perspectives, I would read that all the time. And just, there'd be an
Don't
essay
forget
by,
Source,
sorry?
Source magazine also.
Yes.
Robert Ashley and that crew.
But I never recovered from this Brian Eno article in Perspectives, which was generating and organizing variety in music. I remember the title precisely.
When did he
And
write that?
what year?
Was it in the 70s?
Early 70s.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm talking about mid 60s to like in this period. We had Stockhausen writing in Deria, and it was all bullshit.
Okay,
But
yeah. Wait a
it was
minute.
very
No,
technical. He was
I'm
such a
very interested in
trickster.
Stockhausen. You can't just say it was bullshit.
Oh no, I don't mean that.
What?
I don't mean it was uh bullshit what he wrote. What I mean, he was playing with people
Ah,
because everybody was writing everything. Everything people today might not understand. So I'm just going to mention this. That in the 50s and 60s, music became, in the academic world, became very, very scientific. We wanted our music to be scientific. And so starting with Schoenberg and Webern, we organized, well, with Schoenberg, we organized pitch according to a row, having it going through forwards and backwards and through various permutations. And then with Webern, we took it a step further and organized other parameters of music, such as timbre. And then finally, with what we call post-surrealism with Stockhausen and Berio and that whole crew, we organized every parameter of sound, including well, duration, rhythm. And if you
dynamics.
look at the piano pieces of Stockhausen, the first four piano pieces, Klavierstücke 1 through 4, every pitch has a different dynamic, and that's
Yes.
because they're all ordered. And so we were thinking very, very scientifically,
Yes.
and everyone in Daria was writing these like highly philosophical and words that were so difficult to understand and read. And Stockhausen played a joke on people, and he wrote an article that was so technical nobody could understand it, and he did it on purpose. It was meaningless,
Oh,
and just as a joke. Stockhausen was great. I mean, he was such a trickster.
he
Uh,
was, wasn't he? Tell me a little bit about your experience with Stockhausen.
I never met the man personally. Uh, I attend the only piece live I attended was a 6 hour portion of Licht, which was done at California Institute of the Arts, which was blew my mind. Um, so I have no personal one-on-one experiences with Stockhausen, but was highly influenced uh, as a composer. And the point that I'm coming to, or that I wanted to make for what the atmosphere was in the 60s
Yes.
was if that you were, uh, which was very different from the 70s, um, if you're a young composer starting out, you wanted your music to be complex, and you wanted your music, you weren't going to write tonal music. If you wanted to be with it, you wanted to write atonal music. Da bum ba bum 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 dum bum ah, ah. That kind of a tonality. Uh, or at least have a little bit of noise in your piece.
Well, there's
And
that, and it's interesting too because Boulez had the concept of constant renewal. So it's like good luck getting anything to hang on to, folks. You're constantly just being hit with what you can't determine is formed information.
and it went so far as
Yeah.
that Milton Babbitt had an article come out in the New York Times that you probably read when you were a kid. Who cares if you understand? And the atmosphere back then was uh, you had to have a master's degree in music to understand the what was going on, or at least be in love with somebody who did have the master's. Uh, in order to get it, because we weren't concerned with reaching a wider audience back then. We
No.
were concerned with Platonic ideas and the um, well, then don't forget Xenakis. We're coming out of how do you pronounce that word?
Stochastic and also coming
Stochastic
out
ideas.
of Corbusier's architectural. So he's also mathematic. Yeah.
And talk about loud. I heard a piece of it at the Museum of Modern Art, electronic piece. The name slips my mind, but it was loud and it was great, and I
Yeah.
loved it.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, Okay, we've only been talking for about 20 minutes, but I'm so excited, I have to tell you, because this is an area that you've not only inhabited your whole career, but embodies what I think is the best thing about music, which is how is it all related? Because in your mind, Rhys Chatham's mind, I know that you have context for everything. And that I'm talking to somebody who has seen the avant-garde film world of New York, who has seen the art world, who has been involved with combining high concept music with rock and roll sounds. You talk about, I mean, it's so great that we talk about Perez because I'm going to ask you about the Ramones next.
Oh, but we're not there yet.
I
Uh,
know we're not there, but we
uh,
have to get there. So,
no, okay, we will, and we
okay.
will. Greg, I promise.
Okay. Thank you.
But you might. So I wasn't writing tonal music. I hated tonal music. I didn't listen. Well, okay, I listened to the Grateful Dead, the Rolling Stones, and then a girlfriend slipped this really weird group, the vinyl under my door one day. They called the Velvet Underground, and, I liked that. But I listened to that rock while I was cleaning out the house. I'd never been to a rock concert. I wasn't interested. And my passion was what in France we call musique contemporaine, contemporary music. And um, so there was this wonderful series of contemporary music that happened at a place, maybe you attended some of them, called the Electric Circus,
Oh, yeah.
which was located on St. Mark's between 2nd and Bowery or 3rd Avenue. And the front was painted electric blue, and the inside was like a cow's stomach. And Tony Martin, the light artist, had these blobs going over the place. And it was a dance space with no bar, but there was plenty of wicked weed in there.
Mm-hmm.
But a lady named Thais Latham did a series of concerts there, a Monday night series that featured contemporary music. And so we would have Robert Ashley playing Wolfman, Salvatore Martirano was playing his piece, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The first thing I saw there, oh gosh, Greg, I got to tell you about this. The
Please.
first concert in her series that I saw was a chess match between John Cage and Marcel Duchamp. And the chessboard was wired up to a series of gates that would open and close the music of 4 electronic music composers. Those electronic music composers being David Tudor on on electronics, David Behrman, Gordon Muma, and Nanjun Pike, all in separate corners.
Murderer's Row of electronic music.
Yeah, and so that John had his long cigarette holder, and Marcel Duchamp, and they were concentrating, playing chess, and having a ball. And Gordon Muma, who's a wonderful communicator, was telling people, while he was doing his electronics things, what's this, what's that, and he said, "Oops, looks like they made a move. I just got turned off." And so that was wonderful. And there were a whole series of concerts. And then this anthology came out called An Anthology that was put out by Jackson McLoughlin and Lamont Young. And in it, I saw an interesting score by a composer named Terry Riley that looked a little bit like uh, 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 John Cage's Variations 5, which is like a graphic piece with lots of scratches on it. So I said, oh boy, this is going to be a really noisy concert. I'm going to go to that. So I went there and I paid my $5, which I was a teenager, so that was a lot of money for me.
Mhm.
And $5 was worth more back in the 60s. And I went up and so there was this long hair, guy with long red hair and hippie pants, hippie, um, playing circus organ. And I was disgusted. You know, it was like completely tonal. Uh, I hated it. And so I went downstairs and tried to get my money back, and he wouldn't give me my money back. So I said, "Oh, what the heck? I'll go back up and give it another chance." And I listened. I said, "You know, this isn't so bad." And then I listened to it more. I said, "You know, actually, this is quite good." And of course, it turned out to be a version of Terry Riley's seminal piece, A Rainbow in Curved Air.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went on to play with the composer David Rosenboom on viola, Poppy No Good's Phantom Band, which is his piece where he takes two Revox tape recorders, puts them 20 feet apart, and channels the sound of the first recorder going to the second recorder, creating a delay going back into the first. And he was playing soprano saxophone, which the music critic of the New York Times, Harold Schoenberg, mistakenly thought was a clarinet because he had no idea what a saxophone was. He's a classical music critic. But it was a soprano saxophone. And with this tape delay technique, which people today know as frippatronics, um, uh, because Fripp used the
Yes.
exact same system, which he got from Brian Eno, and Brian Eno didn't tell him where he got it from.
Ah.
Sacre Brian. And uh, because Brian, of course, knew where we got the idea from, what's his name, but who cares who had the idea? Robert Fripp did something completely different with it.
Yes.
Talk about context. And, you know, it's not because someone wrote the first piece for orchestra that another person can't write a piece for orchestra.
And also, Rhys, isn't it this long tone music? Isn't this idea somewhat coming from drones that we heard in Indian music? Where is that coming from? Because you're talking about Lamont Young, you're talking about a kind of a new kind of music that would come to be known as process music or drone music or minimalism. Where do you land on this?
Okay, back then, there was no such thing as minimalism or drone music. And the way those things evolved, but there was a thing that was called pot. And there were pot, known as grass, tea, if you like, and
Tea.
controlled substances.
Yes.
And people were smoking them,
Mm-hmm.
and it opened people up
Mm-hmm.
to Ravi Shankar
Mm-hmm.
and Indian music, uh, and so we can hear those influences. We heard those. Terry Riley was not studying Indian music when he first came up with music of long duration in the early 60s. Dorian Mode. I'll get into how he studied because I studied with the same teacher as Terry Riley. But when Terry did Dorian Mode, which was predated um, A Rainbow in Curved Air, uh, that well, I should start at the beginning. Uh, at the beginning of music of long duration in America, we have to start with Lamont Young. Uh, in Lamont Young, 1958, Lamont wrote a piece while he was getting his master's degree at, I think it was in LA. Um, I think he studied with Roger Sessions. Is that possible?
I thought Sessions was at East Coast.
Um, I've forgotten who he studied with, but it was a serialist composer.
Okay.
And even back then, he was writing stuff that was really, really slow. And his teacher said to him, you know, that's music for a young man, for an older man. Yeah, you should be writing stuff with lots of noise and percussion in it. And so in 58, he wrote this piece called String Trio, which has been played by the Kronos Quartet and by other string players. And it's a really, really slow. And Lamont, that's just what he was into,
Yeah.
writing slow music.
So he hadn't heard Indian music.
Nobody was talking about it back then.
It would have
Uh,
not been easily available, right?
he didn't get influenced by Indian music until I think the mid 60s.
Wow.
But in any case, then he and Yoko Ono produced a series of concerts in Yoko's loft, which is, I think it was on Chambers Street, in the early to mid 60s. Grapefruit, Yoko Ono's book of performance pieces, upon which Brian Eno modeled his discrete strategies, is Lamont had written a piece, Draw a Straight Line and Follow It, you know, and so he would do that for hours. And then he did a soprano saxophone interpretation of it, where he just played this long tone with circular breathing. And so we can trace minimalism in America back to Lamont in like around 62, like around then, or even with his piece String Trio in 58. And that evolved, and without doubt, both Terry Riley and Lamont Young had studied music academically, but both of them came very, very strongly out of the jazz tradition. Terry, during after the war, had played in Europe with Chet Baker and playing piano in club situations and jazz
Yep.
and cool jazz.
Mhm.
And Lamont was an amazing saxophone player. I mean, he would just play in various modes, generally in the key of E flat, since he was playing a sopranino
Oh,
saxophone,
Sopranino.
which is higher
And it's E
than a
flat,
soprano
right?
saxophone. It's an E flat, yeah. And he would had formed this band called the Theater of Eternal Music, and he had two string players with John Cale on viola and Tony Conrad on the violin. Now, Tony Conrad, as it turned out, was a mathematics major from Harvard, and Lamont wasn't playing in just intonation back then, but Tony was. Tony was had found a 19th century composer. I can't remember the name. It might have been Bieber, but who had written in just intonation, and he was introduced in just intonation with that. And as a mathematics major, he was fascinated by Pythagoras and Pythagorean theory, and introduced it to Lamont. And so he and of course on sopranino saxophone, one couldn't play in just intonation because the keys are geared towards equal temperament. Equal temperament is the gam, the scale that we use in Western music, consisting of 12 equal semitones. But and just intonation is a system that's based on one fundamental frequency. And when you play a fundamental frequency, you hear many tones. For example, if you play a middle C on piano, in addition to the middle C, you hear an octave above that. It's called an overtone, and then a fifth above that, and an octave above that, a third above that, a fifth above that, a seventh above the fundamental, but it's a flat seventh. It's not an equal tempered seventh. And I was tuned as trained as a harpsichord tuner by William Dowd in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to make a little bit of spending money. My girlfriend thought I was a drug dealer because she couldn't figure out how I was making money. I'd disappear into a recording studio and come out with $15, for the recording.
You had your briefcase.
Yeah, and with my briefcase, yeah, exactly. But I wasn't a drug dealer. I was a harpsichord tuner. And as a harpsichord tuner or a piano tuner, we would listen to these overtones in order to be able to tune. Because in the equal temperament, when you tune a fifth, we have to tune it slightly flat, getting this thing called beat phenomena. Wow, wow, wow. And back in the 60s and before everybody had electronic music, hearing these beats, it took me 6 months to figure out what the heck they were. And that's another long story. I won't get into my harpsichord training, but uh, Tony, getting back to the Theater of Eternal Music and Lamont
Yes.
Young, Tony and Cale played in Just a Nation. Because it's easy to do on string instruments because there are no frets. And so they played perfectly in tune fifths. And Lamont had Robert Moog build him a special synthesizer with highly stable sine wave generators that had these perfect fifths being played. And Angus MacLeese on percussion playing hand drums. And Lamont would play sopranino saxophone using circular breathing, creating these endless patterns in E flat, which were
The
they
looping.
weren't they. Oh, he didn't use a looper. I
He
mean,
just did circular breathing.
yeah, he did circular breathing, and so they were endless, and it was the first time I heard it. It was I wasn't on any drugs or I didn't take anything mood altering, but I felt a real shift in consciousness. This was coming out of jazz. This was not coming out of Indian music initially. Uh, John Coltrane had been playing modally. And well, John would listen to Indian music also, and then so eventually did Lamont, and the Indian music. Ravi Shankar had come to the States, uh, and at this point, uh, Lamont had, through a meditation workshop, I believe, run into a uh, Indian master vocalist named Pandit Pran Nath, and was so taken, who had a very slow style of singing North Indian classic music, and so naturally Lamont was attracted to it, and became his disciple. Now, the thing about and then various other people studied with Pandit Pran Nath, also the composer Charlemagne Palestine, John Hassel worked with him, and I studied with Pandit Pran Nath also,
And
who was
Hassel too, right?
John Hassel.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll do this very quickly, but there was an author dispute in the Theater of Eternal Music with Lamont insisting that he was the composer of the music, and John Cale and Tony Conrad having gone into it, understanding that it was a collaborative effort.
Collaborative, yeah.
And so because of that, those sopranino saxophone tapes were never released because Lamont had the tapes, even though the tapes physically belonged to Tony, and he wouldn't release them because he wasn't willing to share composers' rights.
Can I ask
And
how you feel about that when we talk about sidemen and collaborative music making?
well, I think that Lamont is in the wrong here because they went into it as a collaborative effort, and it's obvious who did what on the recordings. It's obvious that John played viola and contributed his viola parts. Tony contributed his violin parts. Lamont didn't write those out. And Angus MacLeese, Lamont did certainly not write out the percussion parts. Hello. And so what's the problem, right? And uh, but anyway, Lamont didn't see eye to eye with them, and because of that, the tapes were never released. So anyway, he had to form another band, and I'm getting to John Hassel in this. The the new band consisted of Lamont and Marion, me, and another. Um, I'd started studying with Lamont at that point.
And what are you playing at this point?
And another composer named Lenore Shue on vocals. And so we were the singer. Lamont soloed, and we backed him up.
What instrument were you playing, Rhys?
I was vocalist.
Oh,
This was the period where I was studying with Pandit Pranath, who's a vocalist. And my lessons, but one thing at a time. Um, and John Hassel was on trumpet,
yeah.
and Garrett List, a trombone player,
Wow.
may he rest in peace, who became music director of the kitchen after me, and brought jazz into the kitchen, was on trombone, and that was the band. And I got close with John during that period, and John told me that one thing that Pandit Pranath told him was, don't become an Indian musician. Take what I'm teaching you, put it through a personal filter, and make your own music with it. And that's exactly what John did. And we heard the result on that wonderful album he did with Brian Eno, whose name, I can't remember the name of the album. It's the Pink album,
Yeah.
but it's just absolutely gorgeous. And you hear John's half-valving technique. And I'm a trumpet player. And, yeah, I tried to imitate my good friend John, and but he's the master. I'm a
Yes.
composer who plays trumpet. He's a trumpet player and a composer. Voila.
Yes. Yeah.
He's the master.
It's so interesting to me, Rhys, to talk to someone who really did seriously play each of the instruments. You weren't like pick it up, learn it for a tune, put it down. You went deeply into vocal. You went deeply into trumpet. You went deeply into flute. You went deeply into guitar.
True.
Why? How?
Oh, well, perhaps we should segue into guitar,
Whatever you like.
because that would answer your question. Well, the reason I didn't do it on purpose. I mean, I got in flute. I mean, it wasn't from any philosophical heavy duty notion until I picked up guitar, and then it became a
Oh,
philosophical
see, now
choice.
that's interesting. So you were like, were you drifting to learn and to experience, and then something
Well,
happened?
well, the thing was, I mean, so I was my instrument of virtuosity was flute, and and then I wanted to study Lamont. I tried to produce. I founded this place called The Kitchen
Yeah.
in 1971. I founded the music program there. It was founded by electronic image artist Woody Enstein of Asolka, And they invited me to do a music program there, and I modeled my program on the initially presenting electronic music exclusively from my friends at NYU. Uh, Initially, I had studied with Morton Subotnick in NYU, and I played Buchla, and I took composition lessons with him, and he said, "I don't study harmony, study counterpoint. That's what you need, counterpoint, counterpoint." So we studied lots of counterpoint, and I was still a teenager, and when I first started studying with him, and uh, uh, he let me in there on weekends to use the Buchla synthesizer, and then it was in the intermedia program at NYU, and then there I met a whole bunch of composers. Uh, he had Morton had put me in this little closet, with it set up with Buchla modules that he wasn't using, and I saw ladies' undergarments in this neatly hung up. So someone might be living there. It turned out to be Marianne Amichet. And Marianne was sort of camping out there because she was working on a piece for None Such Records. And there I met Charlemagne Palestine, and we started jamming together. And Charlemagne, what was I doing back then? I was doing, sorry. Mais non, je ne peux pas parler. Je te rappelle dans une heure, d'accord? Ciao. Sorry, I thought that was turned off. It says do not disturb. That's weird. Well, where was I? Oh, yeah. So Charlemagne Palestine was there, and this was 69. And I was doing music that was like Morton, the student imitates the teacher, right? So what did my music sound like? Boop, 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 boop. It was heavily sequencer oriented and rhythmic, as it were. And although the written compositions remained post-serialist. But then I met Charlemagne, and Charlemagne was doing these slowly evolving uh, ring modulated timbral music, which I thought was very interesting. And he was 5 years older than me, so I kind of looked up to him as a big brother. And at this point, he was not aware of the music of Lamont Young,
Hmm.
or Charlemagne is one of these people who never needed to study. I mean, he went to Manus and California Institute of Arts, but he never needed to study with anybody. I mean, he's just such a font of creative ideas. And so I took him to hear a concert of Lamont, and he was so pissed that somebody was doing music of long duration 10 years before he was. And it was a spirit of competition that existed between them that has lasted throughout their lives. And but of course, Charlemagne's music is very different from Lamont's. The primary piece he's known for is strumming music, which is this beautiful piece for Bosendorfer piano, where he plays the same chord uh, in a strumming fashion, uh, and working where the primary melodic vocabulary is the overtone series that we hear emanating from the Bosendorfer piano, which is very good at emanating
Yeah.
harmonics and overtones.
Having played with Cecil Taylor, I'll agree with you.
Yeah, in fact, at the kitchen, we did a duo concert with Cecil Taylor opening for 1 hour, and then Charlemagne played for an hour. It was a
Wow.
wonderful evening.
Is there a
What was your
complete
question?
gig? I know my listeners are geeking out hard on this discussion, and I am. Is there a gigography from the beginning of the kitchen to the current? Is there any kind of listing?
There are listings, but I haven't compiled them.
Yeah.
The archivist at the kitchen should
Oh, okay.
should do that. But in any case, I'm going to segue into the kitchen and then I'm going to get into guitar. How does that sound?
Great. But before we pass long duration music, I wanted to ask if you had an impression at the time of Morton Feldman's music.
When I was 16, or maybe no 16, I heard, I forget what record it was on, but I heard Durations and and immediately started writing graphic music and played it for the kids at I had this great teacher at two great teachers at Third Street Musical School, Donald Stratton and Tom Manoff, who were Manhattan School of Music people. And in Stratton's theory class, he had all of the students get our instruments and write music for it. And that was actually my first experience with composition. And so I started, well, I wrote some pieces, but but fairly soon afterwards, I started doing graphic music. And then I was at a concert at Carnegie Recital Hall, and I forgot who it was, but I found myself in the men's room during the intermission. And who should be standing next to me but Morton Feldman? And I said, I was a teenager, right? And I was struck. I was but for me, the composers like Morton Feldman and Ralph Shapey and certainly, well, Stockhausen was a superstar, but they were for me they were my rock stars.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, "Oh, Mr. Feldman, I liked your piece, Durations," and Mort.
Mm-hmm.
He said, the musicians didn't like it so much.
Yeah.
I later found out that was typical Morton Feldman response. But
Can I tell you a funny Babbitt story?
oh yeah, by all means.
Okay. So I'm sitting behind, as often was the case, Mr. and Mrs. Babbitt would come to the concerts and sit together. And so I'm at, I think, Columbia at Miller, and they're playing, oh God, I can't remember if it was the jazz one, All Set, and or All Set for Jazz, but it might have been another one. And Mr. Babbitt was afterwards asked by Mrs. Babbitt, well, what did you think? And he said the following, and I remember this distinctly. Well, the percussionist played 92% of his part correctly, and the pianist played about 87% of the material correctly. Nobody really was above 90%. And it blew my mind because it was like the follow through. Like he lived that fucking concept all the way up to the moment of birth and just kind of going, well, that's interesting then, isn't it? That people are having trouble getting into the 90 percentile and these are the best players. So that kind of thing I find very interesting when we talked about complexity earlier, just sort of throwing back to that. But I don't mean to interrupt your flow. Please.
Well, I'm sure they did their best. I'll tell you my Milton Babbitt story. When I first started the kitchen, Milton Babbitt lived up the street from me on 19th Street. And the first person I invited was Milton Babbitt. And so I innocently called him up. I didn't know him, and and told him about the place and what it was. And he said, "How old are you?" And I said, I'm 19." And he said, nobody serious can produce a concert series at 19. Click. And after that, I lied about my age after
Yeah.
that and said I was 22. And the next person I called up was Philip Glass. And Philip was so nice. And uh, Philip, of course, you had asked earlier um, about where these terms process music and minimalism and phase music and things like that were coming out of. Uh, the brief answer to that is back then we didn't have this thing called the internet. And
Mm.
so what you have to remember, what artists did in the 50s, if you were an artist, you went to Greenwich Village. That's where my parents met each other. And they lived on McDougal Street, which is the first apartment I remember. And but that got too expensive, and all the artists moved to this area called Soho. And the reason all the artists wanted to move in together was because that was a way we could communicate. And the additional interest in Soho was that all these lofts were formerly machinist shops, sweatshops, and so people moved into them. And Philip Glass developed the entire music of changes and music in 12 parts in these lofts. So essentially, he developed, and Steve Reich also developed their music in various people's loft. They charged $5 at the door or something like that to pay the musicians, and developed the music that way. But the sense of community was very, very important. One, you'd have Philip Glass and the sculptor Richard Serra going to a concert of Joan Jonas, for example, a choreographer, or Yvonne Rainer. And the next day you'd see them on West Broadway and Spring Street in the little Puerto Rican breakfast place talking about it.
Yeah.
And this was happening constantly, this cross-fertilization of ideas. And so Richard Serra, who was doing process art, along with, I think, Michael Snow, I might have that wrong, but both in the context of Michael Snow's
Filmmaking,
yeah, with Wavelength and films like that. And Philip got very influenced by the ideas that were happening in the visual art community. And eventually his music came to be called or labeled process music because it made sense in terms of what was happening in the New York art world at that time. Steve's music, of course, with his piece Piano Phase, where a riff that's essentially a paradiddle on piano goes slowly out of phase, comes out of that piece. The term minimalism wasn't used back then. I think it might have been the Village Voice critic Tom Johnson, who in the early 70s coined that word. Nobody liked it. I didn't care because I was too young to care. Yeah, call me a minimalist, tell me what I'm doing. And but the other composers, oh no, what we do is maximalism. And
that's interesting though, isn't it? Because what I believe in maximalism is sort of Fahrenheit or something like that. That's what I would call maximalism. And then minimalism, let's face it, there's a much smaller statistical density in every area.
Oh yeah.
Fair?
I have no problem calling it minimalist. I call myself a post-minimalist composer. I mean, you have to call it for what it is,
Well,
right?
and I don't care. Actually, I'm with you. I don't. I mean, when I talk to older cats, it's like we just called it music,
Oh,
100%.
the public needs a label
Yeah,
it's marketing. Come on. Give me a break.
100%. But I'm interested too in that. Everybody. It was more about the individual than it was about a movement. And it was about more about a crossbreeding of conceptual art that may have been sound, but it could have also been visual. And so I think of a filmmaker like Stan Brakhage, and I think silent, but very compositional, very process. We see the painting change over time. Would you agree that this is all part of a general conceptual individualist, a kind of what I call the rugged American individualist?
Well, uh, yes, and I'm not being hesitant in saying that, but I will add this. What Brian Eno observed this when he first came to New York in the 70s, and he was very interested in the downtown music scene, of course, and the art scene. And he made an observation that was very, very true. He found that each composer defined their own little area of expertise, and it was considered bad taste if you invaded it. And so nobody would mistake the music of Steve Reich for that of Philip Glass, who was conversant with them.
So true.
That started changing with when composers started working with rock instrumentation, and people from the rock world started working with ideas coming out of European classical music.
And that's you. You're there at the beginning of that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we need to get to that. So whenever you want, sir.
Well, what happened was I was programming music at the kitchen. I was there from 71 to 73. And at first I invited my friends from NYU, like Laurie Spiegel, Michael Tchaikovsky, Serge Terepnin, this one and that one, Morton Subotnick, of course. And but gradually we found that there was a real need in Soho for playing at our space, because we had a slick performance space called the Mercer Arts Center. And it had a sound system, it had video. If you wanted a proscenium stage, we had folding chairs. If you wanted it in the circle, we got rid of the folding chairs. It was a very versatile space. And we had a Steinway piano. So when Frederick Chesky came to play there, he was very happy. Then I left and Garrett List took over. And he did an interesting thing of merging Frederick Chesky. Do you know about Frederick?
Of course, yes.
Well, I have to mention this. He
Please.
came to New York from Italy. He had a group there with Alvin Curran and Steve Lacy and others called Musica Electronica Viva, which was essentially free improvisation using electronic music instruments, and primarily. And well, of course, Frederick played piano. Richard Teitelbaum was on Moog, and but Frederick moved from Italy to New York and got a gig as an organ player at some church in Brooklyn, and worked with. He realized that he was doing free improvisation in the context of academic music, and in the meantime, composers of the period, like Luciano Berio with his Sequenza series, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen with piano piece number 11, who did Volo Solo, the English composer that was Stockhausen's assistant for
Hugh Davies?
No. He died. He was a Marxist. Oh, I have what we in French we say un trou de mémoire. Well, anyway, they were all breaking away from the tyranny of the written page until finally Musica Electronica Viva and a group in Britain called AMM, featuring David Toop and this composer I was mentioning, and the composer you mentioned, all those people doing free improvisation.
Mhm.
And so Frederick came to New York and he realized, there's this other group of people that's also doing free improvisation, and namely African American art music. And so he teamed up with Carl Berger of Creative Music Foundation, and they started working with composers coming out of that tradition,
Mhm.
like Anthony Braxton,
Mhm.
Mule
Fred
Richard
Gill.
Abrams,
Mhm.
and that whole crew. And Frederick and Carl started an orchestra that had the effect of having people coming out of both camps playing together for the first time. And I was a member of this group. It was called the Mev Orchestra. And it was the first time I had improvised. And the first time most of us coming out of conservatory had done free improvisation like that. And so it was a very formative experience. And Garrett was a member of this also, and later became a member of the core group of Mev New York, which consisted of him on trombone, Gordon Moumon, French horn, Frederick, and somebody else who I can't remember. Became the music director of the kitchen after me. And in order to show composers more and more began integrating improvisation into their written works, fully notated works. And Garrett, in order to show the two camps, began programming what the downtown community referred to as jazz at the kitchen. And this caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised, and it caused a lot of contention, because the composers from Soho and Tribeca were saying, we don't have that many places to play. We have the kitchen and we have Phil Niblock's
Experimental Intermedia.
Experimental Intermedia Foundation at 224 Center Street. And I know it well. I practically lived there.
I was there. I did Phil's last interview there.
May he rest in peace.
Yes, sir.
And so it caused some bad feelings, but Garrett stuck with it. And there were these marvelous concerts with Don Cherry's group. And when the creative AMM came to play from Chicago.
Do you see, though, I have to tell you,
everybody's minds.
I have to tell you how important that moment is for a high school student like Gregg Bendian, because we didn't see any of the barriers, because you guys were ignoring them and putting it all. And I do, and this is the whole purpose of this podcast, is if you put it all in the same box, everybody's dealing with the same issues. Is it all written down? To what minutia is it written down? Is it completely free? Are there verbal instructions? Is everyone responding to a dot on a page? What is going on to make this thing happen? And all of it is creativity, and a lot of it is crossbreeding.
In the mid 70s, what you heard from, I'm going to call them downtown composers. As
Okay.
opposed to uptown composers, downtown composers, Phil Glapp, Steve Reich, Lamont, that whole crew. Uptown composers, Milton Babbitt,
Warren and
Elliott Sharp. It's
no, Elliott Carter. You got the downtown train for Elliott Sharp.
We'll talk about Elliott shortly, but the thing that was on everybody's minds, Phil Glass's, John Gibson's, everybody, Laurie Spiegel, everybody was saying it. We want to make music that's not in the ivory tower. That's you don't need a master's degree in order to apprehend. But if you do have the master's degree, it won't melt in your hands. And right.
I like
And
it.
so we wanted to make a music that was formally vigorous, yet
Huh.
more accessible. And Philip Glass and Steve Reich, uh, Philip, joked around and say, "I'm reinventing tonality," and and of course, all of this music was tonal or modal. And
Even triadic, I think.
then what Garrett and Carl were expressly trying to do was to rip down the hierarchical barriers because prior to the mid 70s, we had this hierarchical pyramid
Hmm.
where what in French we call the musique savante, the wise music,
Yeah.
the classical musical there, j'aime,
The
the,
high,
the
the high, yeah, the high art.
the highbrow music,
Yeah.
meaning European classical music, coming out of the European tradition. That was at the top of the pyramid. Jazz was classical musicians back then had no idea of what was involved with the training of a jazz musician. No idea. Uh, I had one classical buddy here in France say to me, John Coltrane would play a wrong note, and then he'd improvise off that wrong note in a wonderful way. Right? No idea about what 251 changes, 251 and playing it over any key at any speed and having to learn a blues scale at any speed in every single key and knowing all your majors and all your minors and 2/5 progressions, et cetera, et cetera. No idea. Jazz back then was considered as opium inspired improvisation.
Okay.
And it was lower down on the hierarchy. It wasn't considered as advanced. And rock, at the bottom of the pyramid, wasn't even considered music. That isn't music, that's noise. And so this feeling was still there. And so what Garrett and Carl were consciously trying to do was to break down those barriers. Now, this work had already started to be done on the classical side by Philip and Steve, Philip
And
Glass
Gunther
and Steve Wright,
Schuller.
and Gunther Schuller, and don't forget about who's that other nice man? Saltzman? Eric Saltzman. Don't forget
Mhm.
him.
Don't
He had
forget.
a an ensemble that people played in that, so it was coming from where did Gunther Schuller teach again? It was
In New England.
yeah, New England, right.
Mhm.
Uh but anyway, it was in the air. We're breaking down these hierarchies. And so Garrett wanted to reflect that in the kitchen, which he did for I think 3 years. And then in the meantime, I was out of harpsichord tuning work because of the invention of the digital tuner.
Ah,
And so I reverted back to the traditional way of making money for a musician. I became a bartender. And and I was a bartender 2 bars up from what is was I don't want to say that. It's on the Bowery and 6th Street. And and I got sick of it very quickly. And in the meantime, a technician's job had opened up at the kitchen. And so I worked as Garrett's technician and got to record all these concerts of Don Cherry, and it was just marvelous. And then when Garrett left, I returned as music director. Uh, when I came in as music director, it was a non-paying position because we were just all doing it out of love. And then after 2 years, we got burned out. But when I came back, it was a paying position,
hmm.
and we paid all the musicians flat fees also.
Hmm.
And because we had a very talented administrator who directed the kitchen, named Robert Stearns, who was a very good fundraiser, and so he pulled the place up by its bootstraps so it could pay flat fees to musicians and could pay the people who are programming there, what are now known as curators. Uh, and so I thought that what I do in the meantime, we had the punk explosion uh, in New York, and I have to back up just a bit. Uh,
And that is such an interesting moment because there's going to be an intersection of rock music and serious music.
well, what happened, the way it happened for me was uh, prior to 76, most of the composers that I had been working with were older than me, but I had an influx of composers come into New York from Mills College that were my age. And it had all been studying with Robert Ashley and David Behrman and Blue Jean Tyranny. And one of them asked me to do a concert at the Kitchen. His name is Peter Gordon, a sax player. And Peter was doing something very interesting. He had written this piece called Macho Music that was heavily influenced by rock. And this was the first instance that I had ever seen a composer merging so completely rock music with ideas coming out of minimalism and classical music. And I heard it and I wasn't so sure. And, but I wanted to program that at the Kitchen. I had my doubts, but Peter was very smart, and he had this thing called the Love of Life Orchestra, which was rehearsing at West Beth, which is over on the west side. It was where Merce Cunningham had his studios on the top floor, but Peter was in the basement sharing the studio with Arthur Russell, who at the time was my roommate. And but that's another story. But Peter invited me to play flute in the Love of Life Orchestra, and I had never played music. I never played in a rock group before. And in this group were Ernie Brooks from the Modern Lovers on bass, and Arthur Russell was on cello, and David Van Tighem on drums, and and Scott Johnson on electric guitar. And I loved it. And so one night after rehearsal, Peter and I were walking down Bleecker Street. We both were living in the East Village at that point. And but prior to that, I had been living in Soho, but it got to be too expensive. So I moved to the East Village. And Peter said, "Rhys?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Have you ever in your entire life been to a rock concert?" And I said, "Well, no. I hadn't. I was 25 years old and I'd never been to a rock concert. I mean, I'd listened to rock, but on the record player, but I'd never been to a concert." And he just laughed and he said, "There's this cool group that's playing tonight, very nice group at a new place that's opened up near where we live. Why don't we go to it together?" And so the year was 1976. The month was May, and the group was the Ramones, and their record had just come out by the same name on Sire Records. And so I went to this concert. It's that place called CBGB's, and I'd never seen anything like it in my life. If my first epiphany was seeing Terry Riley play a Rainbow and Curved Air, and walked in there as the Electric Circus as a post-minimalist, and walked out as a hardcore minimalist, although I wouldn't have called it back then. This concert had the same effect on me.
Wow.
These four skinny guys playing electric instruments, and now their music was more complex than what I was doing. Like I was playing one chord. I was just, I played in the Theater of Eternal Music. when I made music, it sounded, it was just like Lamont's, uh, music of long duration, uh, singing drones for hours on end, midnight concerts, singing a low note or multiphonics. And the Ramones were more complex. They were playing three chords, and I was only playing one chord, but I felt a lot in common. Now, as a trumpet players have to find their voice. I mean, as soon as you pick up the trumpet, if it's not classical, people will say, "Ooh, it sounds like Miles," and you have to find a way to make your sound distinctive. And the same is true, as you know, when you're a composer. Every composer has to break past their teachers and find their own voice. And it just so happened at that time, that's exactly what I was doing. And I thought, well, what did Lamont do? Lamont took Indian music and found a way to merge it with the minimalist stuff that he was doing in a way that was very effective. What did Steve Reich do? He had taken the studies he had done with master Ghanaian drummers and merged it with his face techniques to come up with a piece called drumming. Uh, Philip, using the techniques coming out of process art, to merging that with his classical training and his studies with Ravi Shankar, of course. So maybe what I can do is merge the minimals that I'm doing with this three-chord bar chord rock. I mean, that was my initial idea.
Yeah.
And now we get back to not being a colonist. Of course, I could make a piece using a rock instrumentation and play it at the kitchen, a place like that, or play it in an art space. I mean, come on. With Lamont Young doing pieces called "Let a Butterfly Out of the Jar" and calling that music, of course, I could do whatever I wanted. The question was, could I make a piece uh, working exclusively with rock musicians and a rock instrumentation in a rock context and have it work in both contexts? And indeed, that's what happened. I lucked out, and the guitarist of the Love of Life Orchestra, Scott Johnson, had just gotten a new Stratocaster. So he lent me semi-permanently his Telecaster and showed me how to play a few bar chords and basic blues scale. And I thought, hey, this is going to be a cinch. I'll practice real hard, get bloody fingers. And after a month, I mean, I played the Boulez Sonata for flute and piano. I can count to four. This isn't going to be a problem. And so that's what I did. And I formed a band with people coming out. They're actually coming out of an art context. Nina Canal and Robert Appleton. We formed a group called the Gynecologist.
Yes.
And we won a prize in the Village Voice for the worst named band ever. The guy gave a choice: the urologist, the gynecologist, and two other horrible names. And but what I discovered, and I played with them a couple of times, and I realized that I wasn't feeling rock. That I was too, even though I had done improvisation, I was too much into counting in my head and not really feeling it. And so I realized I need to do a bit of field work. And so I joined a band that wasn't my band in order to learn how to really feel rock in a rock context. The band was called Arsenal, with Charlie Nash, who's no longer with us, on vocals and Miranda on keyboard. And after a time, I felt ready to write a piece that would be true to my roots as a minimalist composer, but truly reflect the rock music I loved, and played this piece with the idea in a rock context and not playing. Well, we played in initially. I had a couple of friends, Glenn Branca
Mhm.
and Nina Canal, who was in the gynecologist, and Wharton Tears, who was in a group called the Theoretical Girls. And I gave them guitars that were tuned in octave tunings. They were like so 3 low E strings and 3 D strings tuned to an E,
Hmm.
right? And the idea being it would be like an overtone canon.
Mm.
And I made a piece called Guitar Trio,
Yep.
which originally was for me, Glenn, and Nina, with Wharton on drums, and where the primary melodic material uh, would be the overtones coming out of the electric guitar, undoubtedly influenced by Charlemagne with his piece Strumming, similar idea, but with overt rock rhythm and rock orientation, because we wanted to play this group in rock clubs. And when we finally did at Max's Kansas City, which was the other rock club beside CBGB's in New York in the mid to late 70s, uh, I realized I succeeded in what I was doing. When we would play it for an art audience, like in a loft, the people, the art crowd would think of it as a new strain of minimalism. But when the rock audience heard it, they thought of it as a wall of noise.
Wall of noise.
And people, it didn't matter what they thought of it. What you heard depended on where you were coming from. But one thing that happened at Max's was people were coming back to the soundboard and saying, "Where are you hiding the singers? We hear singers." And when I heard that, I knew that I would succeeded in what I wanted to do. You're hearing the overtones. Normally, to hear overtones, you have to have special training in
Hmm.
order to do that.
Hmm.
Or but in this case, you didn't need any training. It's just that's the advantage of electric guitar. You can turn the volume up. So the overtones were there for all to hear. And when you merge them together with multiple electric guitars, you really heard them. And so that's how I got into rock. And that's how I got into learning that when I pick up an instrument, I have to do the homework. I have to do the field work. And it's not just a question of uh, with trumpet. Oh my God. Uh, can I just tell you the story?
Mhm.
Uh, Later on, I thought I was losing my hearing. But we're in 1983 now. And because I've been playing with electric guitar so much at high volumes. And so I decided I wanted to play a quiet instrument. And so I picked trumpet. And that was stupid. I mean, you can hear a trumpet 3 apartments in any direction. But and then I talked to my friend Jim Staley,
Oh,
who,
Jim, of course, roulette.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I said, "Hey, Jim, I'm playing trumpet." Jim had played in a piece of mine called Four Brass, which we put out on Merz Music I think it was 82. Uh, and Jim said, Rhys, I was 30 at that time. Deciding to play trumpet at age 30 is like deciding to be an athlete at age 30. And what a downer. I was so pissed at
Mhm.
Jim, pissed off. But then later on in the day, I ran into George Lewis at the
Mhm.
kitchen, the trombone player. And I told him, "Hey, George, I'm playing trumpet now." And George just broke out into a big smile. And he said, "Well, Rhys, welcome to the school of sore lips." And uh, but they were both right. Uh, I mean, the thing about trumpet, about guitar, is that if you work really hard within a year, you can at least be playing in a band. maybe not well. I mean, it takes 10 years to learn how to play any instrument well, but at least you can get a start on guitar sooner than you can on trumpet. On trumpet, it takes 5 years before you can even begin playing out as a student. It just takes a long time to get your lips in condition and to hit those high notes. And I didn't start really playing trumpet professionally until I was 10 years in.
So, what was the big guitar idea coming out of thinking of the big guitar ensembles and the guitar orchestras? Somewhat maximalist, no?
Well, I think we're going to save that term for the new complexity, aren't we? But it certainly is maximal. The way the idea started was in the early 80s, I was working with the choreographer Carol Armitage.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time we were doing a duet called Vertige, and we had taken it on the road in Europe. And I told her about this idea that I had to get 100 guitarists together and put them in a black box room, lock the door, and call the piece torture box. and she said, "Oh, Rhys, I don't think you can never get 100 guitarists together. I don't think you know 100 guitarists." So we made a bet that I knew 100 guitarists. So I said, it was in Italy, and I sat down there in the room in Italy, and I realized I made a list. I knew 80 guitarists who would come and play just off the top of my head. And Carol was generous, and she knew 20 others. And so we realized at this point that it would be possible. At that time, I was only working with a guitar trio and a group called the Out of Tune Guitar. It was still 3 guitars. At that time, it was Robert Longo, Gilles Baptiste, and Wharton was still playing drums. But I didn't feel I was ready to write a piece for 100 electric guitars in the sense of, yeah, sure. I mean, if you put 100 electric guitars together and play I Can't Get No Satisfaction, it's going to sound great. And just on the level of spectacle. But I didn't want it to be on the level of spectacle. I wanted to write a piece that would really make use of the sonority of 100 guitars playing. And also to work on the idea of 100 electric guitars playing quietly and what that would sound like. Huh?
Wow.
And there's this thing that we forget about in rock sometimes. It's called dynamics. And so instead of trumpet players have this problem too. We have loud, louder, and loudest. And in trumpet players.
Don't you stick mutes in there to shut you guys up?
It works. We figure a way around it.
Okay.
But anyway, so I realized I needed to up the number of guitars I was working with. So I wrote a piece called, there was this great performance place in New York called 8BC, which was primarily a performance art space. And I thought that it was John Zorn's space because John played there a lot. And, I'll just take this opportunity that John Zorn has always, after I left the kitchen, John Zorn made sure he had single-handedly done so much for the community and always made sure that there was a place for people to play weird music. Yeah. And he has always done that and put out his record label Zadig, which puts out this weird music. So he was and continues to be a real force in New York for the good. And but that being said, I met the owners of 8BC, And they say, oh, no, it's not just John. We do a lot of performance plays. And they would have people like Karen Finley playing there and the Kipper Kids, and Eric Bogosian would do things there. And so I used that place to develop a piece called Die Donnergötter, which is German for the Thunder Gods. And it was a piece I upped the number to 6 in special tunings. And this time I put the guitars in soprano, alto, and tenor tunings, with the soprano guitars 3 D strings tuned to an E and 3 high E strings. The alto guitars 3 normal A strings and 3 G strings tuned to an A. And that low guitar I was telling you about, with the 3 low E strings and 3 D strings tuned to an E. And it got a special sonority that was really beautiful. And I decided I wanted to do this piece completely notated, because guitar trio is not notated. How do you get a rock musician to stop playing music? Put a music stand in front of him. And the famous joke.
Oh yeah.
And that's not true of all rock musicians, but you can't count on rock musicians knowing how to read. And so guitar trio is just prose notation. I tell people what to play and when, but it's done in the oral tradition. So I wanted to write a piece that was completely notated. And I used primarily rock musicians once again. And it turned out, well, because it's minimalism, you just write this is an E. I taught it to them, and they used it as a kind of a visual notation. It didn't turn out to be a problem. And so we developed a piece there, but it wasn't until 1989. I had moved to France. The reason I moved to France is that I married a French dancer who I'd met in Carol's company. And back then we had a wonderful president in France named François Mitterrand, who devoted I think he's wonderful because he devoted 1% of the national budget to the arts, and it changed everything, and it put dance on the map. And so naturally my partner wanted to move back, and she said, Rhys, I'm going back to France. And she didn't say it like that because she had a French accent, but you can come with me if you want, but I'm going back. And I'd always loved France, and I thought it would be an adventure. So I went with her. And when I went there, I hooked up with an agent named Francis Falsetto, who was also a record producer that did a wonderful series of Ethiopian records. I can't remember the name of the label, but if I said you'd know it. And he found me a commission. I told him about my dream to write a piece for 100 electric guitars. And he found a place that would commission me so I could write the piece, to do it and mount it. And it was in Lille, France, which is in the north of France. And that's what we did. It was called L'Aéronef, the spaceship. And I composed, sequencers had just come out back then, and I was working with a program called Dr. T, who many composers will remember fondly. And we were using Atari computers back then because they weren't expensive, and they had an operating environment like Apple, which were more expensive. So we used Atari. And a wonderful instrument had just come out called the Akai S900, which changed the face of hip hop. Prior to the Atari, hip hop was done on turntables with groups like Fab Five Freddy. But with the S900, you could do it on a keyboard, get all these sounds. And so I took samples of the 6 electric guitars and put them on the S900 and use them to simulate what the sound of 100 guitars would be playing as I was writing the piece. So I could have a good idea as I was writing the piece what it would sound like. But still, when we first performed it, we were all nervous because I had no idea. An S900, 100 guitars is not an S900. And when we first heard the 100 guitarists playing, everybody was walking around, all the producers and me and the sound people with big smiles on our faces. It was just like we were in heaven. And so this was in November of 1989. And I fell in love with the sonority. I used the same tunings as I used in the piece, but for 6 electric guitars, bass and drums. So they were all in special tunings. And we toured this piece all over the world, but it didn't get to North America until New Music America in Montreal in 1990.
Well, so you're doing string tunings, but are you doing tuning systems? Are you using microtonal systems at all, or different? No. So this is straight, well-tempered.
Yeah. So this is
overtone series from the tempered system.
Yeah, except there's a lot of ease in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're hearing the overtones, but this piece, it's not a just intonation piece. This is a piece in a special sonority, special tuning, octave tunings, using an orchestra of 100 guitars. And I just wanted to mention the social aspect of this, because an interesting feature of this piece, every time we played it, was that, well, consider that guitarists don't usually play in an orchestra. And they don't have the chance to play in an orchestra. They'll play in a rock group where it'll be 2 guitarists at most, or maybe 3, but I mean, certainly not an orchestra. So here they had the chance to experience what people who play classical instruments get a chance to do. And it was wonderful for them. And generally, by the time we got done, initially the rehearse over 4 evenings and taught the piece over 4 evenings from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Then a 5th evening with a general rehearsal, and then the performances. And by the end of the performances, 2 or 3 new rock groups, people were networking like crazy. They didn't know about each other's existence. And one time we played in Portugal, and the person, it was in Lisbon, and this was, I think it was in the 90s. And the person who organized it was the experimental guitarist, Rafael Toral. And he was the person who was organizing the guitarist and who found the guitarist, and he played in the piece also. And as he was rehearsing the piece, he noticed this cute lady who was one of the other guitarists, and why, they got to talking, and one thing led to another, and after the performance, they got together. And after they got together, they got married.
Wow.
And after they got married, they had a kid. And so I consider myself the godfather of this this childhood thing.
So for people
that to say that many good things, every time we play, something like this happens. And many good things. There's a whole social aspect to this performance that's wonderful. I'm just going to say one more thing. I no longer do that piece, which was called An Angel Moves Too Fast to See, because it's too expensive for producers. And it's too hard on people to have to devote an entire week of rehearsals and performances. So now I have 2 other pieces called A Secret Rose, and another is called A Crimson Grail, which can be done in 2 rehearsals. So I just wanted to get that on the podcast in case.
I was going to ask you then also, where can people find recordings of these pieces? Because I know they want to hear them or see them.
Well, you can hear a recording of the original version of Crimson Grail on a Table of the Elements records. Now, the Table of Elements records is well known as a record label from the 90s and 2000s that put out the music of Tony Conrad, Zena Parkins, the weird music of Thurston Moore and Keiji Haino and Arnold Drive. Oh, the list goes on and on.
Was KG Haino influenced by you?
I doubt it. I saw a concert of his at Danceteria, and he was playing the way he played now back then.
Wow.
And I didn't particularly think it sounded like me.
I played with him once in Japan, and it was really loud.
What?
I played with,
kidding.
and I was playing drum set, but interesting guy too.
I heard him do a concert here in Paris with just hand cymbals, very soft. And I met him at a concert. I think it was in maybe one of those Scandinavian countries. Uh, uh, and we bumped into each other at the hotel. We're playing on the same festival. And he said, we should play together. And I said, yeah, let's do a concert together and surprise everybody and play very softly. And he laughed.
Did you ever see him without his
soft? He didn't play softly
No.
at that festival, and neither did I.
Oh, well, fair game. Have you ever seen him without his sunglasses?
One time we went together to buy some baggage with me, him, and Tony. I don't think he was wearing sunglasses then. But I don't have I haven't met him that many times to remember specifically.
Yeah, it's a big thing in Japan. No one in Japan has seen him without his sunglasses.
I guess he felt like he could maybe take them off around
Yeah.
because we were outside and nobody was going to photograph him.
I don't know if it was that. Actually, it was something much more psychological, but we're not going to get into that right now. Tell me what's happening in your world now, Rhys, in terms of music.
Well, I'm a musician and I like to play music. And so I've devoted quite a bit of energy to these pieces for 100 electric guitars and mounting them. We upped the number to 200 electric guitars and we did it at Lincoln Center. I just wanted to mention, Table of the Elements of Records kind of went out of business for a while, but it's coming back.
Oh.
And we're going to release Crimson Grail soon. And so it will be on Bandcamp.
Mm-hmm.
And so go to Bandcamp for downloading the records. It'll come out as a physical product soon, but keep in touch on my website and on Bandcamp, Table of the Elements Records, to see what they're doing. They're putting on they're re-releasing their entire archive. Who's the other guitarist in Sonic Youth? There's
Thurston and Lee.
Oh, because I had another, we say in French, a hole in my memory. He's a dear friend. Lee Ronaldo has been put out on Table of the Elements Records also. I just wanted to mention that. I didn't want him to think that I would.
Well, and these are guys, it's worth saying Thurston and Lee were a big part of the next wave of people that followed after you, weren't they?
Well, one time I was sitting on my stoop on 3rd Street between First and Second, where I had moved, and uh, who would come, who was walking by, but it was Sonic Youth on their way
Mhm.
to play at the Pyramid Club, which was, and
Oh,
so I said, "Hi, Thurston. Hi, Kim. Hi, Lee," and uh, I said, "Hey, you guys." They just had a big write-up in the Village Voice, and I said, "Hey, you guys are getting a lot of good PR," and they said, Thurston um, said, "Yeah, you and Glenn had your turn. Now it's our turn." And he said that in a loving way, and
yeah.
we just laughed. But it was true. Uh, so Glenn and I got really, everyone was talking about our respective bands and comparing them and saying Rhys sucks, Glenn is great, Glenn sucks, Rhys is great. It's a bit like Philip Glass and Steve Reich.
I had
Great.
thought that. I didn't want to bring it up. Thank you for bringing it up because I remember that. It was like this kind of, because if you read The Voice or if you were on the scene, you knew that there was this Bronca Chatham Bronca.
Yeah, and it was great. I mean, it was great publicity. Like it sold both of our records. And
Yes.
Glenn at one point was I hadn't put out my record on Murs Music and said, Rhys, if I'm gonna have to put out your record, it's gonna look really weird. And but he was gonna he and this guy named Josh Baer, who was produced along with Thurston, produced the Noise Festival at White Columns. He was the owner of White Columns. He had was the money behind Glenn's label, may he rest in peace, uh, Neutral Records. And Glenn put out a number of interesting composers like Michael Byron and others, and of course his own records. And so there was this constant comparison going on, and uh, which in the end served both of us well.
Well, and also didn't the success of Sonic Youth serve you well as well?
Oh, okay. Uh, People in the rock world were wondering why I wasn't jealous of Sonic Youth and Swans. And because the wave,
Swans, yeah.
yeah, I mean, because the wave after uh, Glenn and me was Swans and Sonic Youth, and Swans was intense. Jonathan Cain was on drums, Mike Gerard on electric guitar, and Sue, what was Sue's last name? She was on guitar, electric guitar. Mike was playing bass, of course, and uh, so they were more. I don't like calling it noise, but I guess they were. We could say they were more on the noise side of things. They were aggressive, very much reflecting the energy, aggressive energy. Crack was big on the scene back then,
Mhm.
and they were reflecting this thing, riveting performances. What Sonic Youth did for me that was so interesting was that they merged pop music with ideas that were going around the New York art world in a way that no one had ever done before. And and their stage presence was very different from, it wasn't, Thurston was a gentleman on stage. And so it was a very, very different dynamic, yet somehow complementary. And a guy from Life's Skull uh, asked me once, yeah, aren't you jealous of this happening? And the thing is, he didn't realize that at the time, I didn't think of myself as a rock composer. Uh, I felt of myself as composer coming out of a classical tradition, working with rock instrumentation and rock musicians. And I didn't call myself, I said at the time, I didn't call myself a rock composer because I had too much respect for the form. And uh, I was classifying my music back then as not rock
Right.
because I was playing in rock club. So, but it wasn't until I was about age 40 that I realized I had played more in rock and nightclubs than I had in classical music clubs. And so at that point, excuse my French, but I just said, what the fuck? People can call me whatever they want. And of course, I'm a rock musician now. Of course, I'm a jazz musician. Uh, uh, we didn't even talk about the 10 years I was playing trumpet. I started out studying with Ben Neal, who's a
Oh,
classical player
wow, of
from Manhattan
course.
School of Music. He was in
Yeah.
my band playing guitar, and John Hassel had recommended him, and he became really my right-hand man. And I recommended Ben to Lamont to contract trumpet players for his piece. And Ben is still working with Lamont to this day
Ben Neal,
for,
was he also a very big process trumpet guy? He had a solo thing called bionic trumpet. Is that?
oh, it's amazing. And uh, it was the first time when he did that uh, uh, trumpet with electronic things. He had gone to Stime in Amsterdam and was working with the program they had developed there and had a special set. And it was the first time in my life where I had no idea what he was doing and how he was getting those sounds. And my mouth was watering. I
Mm-hmm.
wish I could do that. But I took a few lessons from him and realized that I didn't need to be studying classical music anymore. I mean, I'd done that with flute. So I decided to study trumpet in the jazz tradition. And by that time, I was in France and I hooked up with a, 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 a French, an American player living in France, whose name I'm having these memory lapses, uh, but who's a dear friend, and and taught me how to play. Aside from all the basic stuff that a trumpet player is supposed to know how to play, uh, how to play high notes in a way that wouldn't hurt my lips. And he was using a technique coming out of a French player named Francois Pichereau. And it's a special way of pursing the lips and using the tongue. And after about study for a couple of years, I was playing in the range of Dizzy Gillespie.
Hmm.
I could hit the normal range for trumpet is up to a C above the middle C. Composers won't hesitate to write up to that note. Stockhausen in his piece for trumpet wrote to an F, which he used for the above that, which his son could play, but nobody else could. I had a friend play it, and he said it's not fair, because it's a hard piece, and then there's this high F.
But Marcus is amazing. I've also
But
played with him. He's an amazing player.
but uh, after I could play in that range, hitting high
Hmm.
triple C's. The problem is I had to practice low notes,
To
and
get that.
yeah, because low notes were hard with this technique, and but I didn't care because I was working in clubs mostly, and high notes was where it was at. It's the only thing you could hear.
You've had unbelievable, varied musical experiences.
Oh, and now I'm going to get to your question, which is what am I doing now? Um, uh, so as I said, I'll go back. I'm a musician, and playing with 100 electric guitars is all very well, but how many of those babies can you mount a year?
Why?
One,
Right.
two,
Yeah.
if I'm lucky. And so I needed to play. And so what I've been doing for the past 10 years is playing solo. Uh, at first, I played just trumpet
Hmm.
and through loops using what do you call those things? Boomerangs. You know those it's a Texas company that makes its 3 loops in one box. Before I was using the DL4, you know, that green box that a lot of guitarists use, but they were too heavy. And so I just did it on trumpet. Uh, but then I said, hey, you know, I'm a guitarist also, so I add guitar to it. And that guitar was in Just Intonation. And it came out on a record on Foom, Foom Records, which is a British label that also puts out the trombonist Peter Zumo, and
Mm-hmm.
Peter Gordon is on it also. I met the guy through Peter Gordon, with whom I remain friends to this day, and Peter Zumo.
Shout out to
And
Pete Zumo.
yeah, oh, Peter Zumo, boy. And we studied with the same trumpet person in New York named Carmen Caruso, who is a great savior of people who have sore lips. But that's another story. But where was I?
Solo current day.
Oh yeah, and so that came out on Foom Records. It's still available. You can find it on Bandcamp. And but I had surgery done on my mouth a couple of years ago, and I couldn't play trumpet for a while. So I said, "Well, what the heck? I'll go back to playing flute." And so that's what I did. And so I started doing these solo concerts with guitar and flute for a couple of years. And now I can play trumpet again, but I'm not back to where I was before because I'm really into playing flute now, transverse flute. And so I recently had a record come out on Cline Gallery with a French guitarist named David Teaneck. And we have a record with another French singer named Gedalia Tarates, who's kind of on the shamanistic side of things. He passed away recently. Uh, on Sub Rosa Records, which is a Belgium label. And finally, oh gosh, this very nice man named Chandra, who has Atoxic Records or something like that. I'll send you the name. It's based in California. That's going to come out with me on trumpet, guitar, and flute with a wonderful French musician named Nico Guerrero. So that's the album that's going to come out next. And so I continue to do solo work. Although, okay, I'll finish with this. I was recently asked to do a private party for ensemble consisting of 60 electric guitars. And so I did this private party, which was for a major enterprise here in France, which I'm not at liberty to reveal because the concert never happened because we were rained out. But so we might do it again. And it's supposed to be a surprise for the people who are invited. It's a private party, so I can't mention who it is.
Okay.
But everyone was so disappointed it got rained out that we did the concert for the staff and the catering staff. And whoa, it was new material. And so this has inspired me. Now I have 60 players in the region of Paris who know how to play this piece. And so what my next project is get 8 of them, or maybe 10, and do a portion of the piece because it just sounded like heaven, guitar heaven. And so that's something I hope to do this year. We'll do it in Paris and see what happens. And then if all goes well, we'll do it outside of Paris.
Rhys Chatham, you blew my mind today. Put it all together in one place. in a way very few people are capable of, and with such clarity. And I have to tell you how much I appreciate it. It's really incredible.
Well, it's a pleasure going down memories lane in this fashion and getting all this information in the short time that we had.
Yeah, I think we got a lot in, and you really are and remain one of the most fascinating musicians of my lifetime. And I'm so honored and pleased to be able to speak with you in detail about this stuff that means so much to me.
A pleasure to be here.
Everybody, Rhys Chatham, listen, if you're here at this point, then you are hardcore. And I would hope that you would hit us on Patreon or, subscribe and make sure that, that there's always a place. We're in our 4th year now of talking to the creators of this incredible body of music that we call creative music. And I thank you all for listening. Hit me on bendianmusic.com. Always happy to hear from people. Always happy to give a lesson. So see you next time. Rhys Chatham, thank you.
Until next time, bye for now.